Hi, this is Teemu Arne from Biohackers podcast. Today I'm talking to Karim Chubin. He's a Swiss naturopath and nutritionist from Geneva. And he was at the Biohackers Summit in Helsinki. And one of his main interests and expertise revolves around hypoxia training. And there's a very specific term for it. It's called hypoxia training, IHHT. And that's the topic we're going to dive deeper into: what oxygen therapy can provide, what are the science, mechanisms, health benefit applications, all of that for anyone interested in improving their anything from lung capacity to oxygen uptake. And we will probably also touch base with different nutritional supplements and herbs that could be of interest here because of his background as a naturopath. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Teemu. Warm thank you for your warm welcome and for having organized this really transformative experience for me. When I came to Helsinki early July, it was my first biohacking conference, and you really managed to create a unique experience, combining different senses, a mixture of academia with an empirical sense, bringing people together. And it's been really wonderful. So thank you very much for having created this.
Yeah, we are always trying our best to architect the best possible experience and a wide variety of different topics and speakers that are able to convey and express information in interesting ways. With hypoxia training, specifically hyperoxia training, what is it? How does it work? Like, how does one do one, and why would one do IHHT?
Perhaps, can I just give you maybe a few words about myself and how I got to it? So I've been in clinical practice since 2000. I was working along the lines of functional medicine for almost 2 decades until I was hit or surprised, let's say, by the Delta form of the COVID in 2021. And I realized that all the supplements, all the good habits, all the diet and the lifestyle changes that I made in my early 20s, all of a sudden met a sort of brick wall. And I understood that the COVID was sent to me as a messenger to rethink the way I understood health and the way I practice naturopathic medicine with my patients. So I'm Swiss, originally from Persia. I have a boutique practice in Geneva, and I had one till 2021. So what happened was that I was hit really badly. My lungs were hit terribly. And the West, as we know, was doing watch and see. It wasn't doing anything really, just waiting for people to either get better or actually to go under oxygen. And what happened here was that I started researching the topic of oxygenation. And I was wondering why I was in such a state. I thought that I'd built up my terrain well enough. I was taking all the supplements that most of us could acquire, high quality ones from Australia and America, had a clean diet, but I was actually going through a personal ordeal, a breakup in my personal life. So clearly the emotions were affecting my immune system, but I had misevaluated and underestimated that impact. To cut a long story short, I started researching it, and I saw there was some research done with hyperbaric chambers in Israel with people with what is now known as long COVID. So I went to the hospital here in Geneva in the long COVID division, and I asked them, look, could you please welcome me in the HBOT division? And he said, but you're not a diver. I said, no, I'm not a diver, but look at my state and look at the research. And I realized I was facing a lot of bureaucracy. So fast forward, I traveled to Russia, which I have very strong affinities with, being also fluent in Russian. I went to Moscow, did a couple of sessions of hyperbaric chamber, and then I went to a sanatorium in what is now known as the New Sochi, a city called Gelendzhik in southern Russia by the Black Sea. Absolutely beautiful city. Went to this stunning clinic, and they told me, young man, we have something even more effective than that. It's known as IHHT. I said, what is it? So to answer your question, they told me, look, essentially, you're not lying in a chamber. We're not giving you excess oxygen, at almost 100% oxygen. You're lying down in a lounging position. You wear a mask, you keep your clothes on, and we take you from sea level up several thousand meters. We create a small stress on your cells by starving your cells of oxygen, so changing the composition of the air, to make it simple. We keep you up in altitude for a few minutes, surprising your cells, and then we bring you down to sea level again, and then we take you up again. So we do this several times over 45 minutes. And by creating this ebb and flow, what I call a cellular surprise, we, through hormesis, create targeted stress, a small stress, which is good controlled stress. We don't use pressure. We use minutes, so the time ratio, how many minutes down, how many minutes up in the mountains, and we change the composition of the air. And by doing that, something fascinating occurs. You have a shift inside the cells at the mitochondrial level. So I was curious. I did a couple of sessions, and my partner at the time, my girlfriend, tells me, "You did not snore last night." And I started feeling more energized. And I realized, hold on a second, if this is affecting my sleep and I'm feeling more vital, and any naturopath or any functional medicine practitioner knows that one of our key aims with our patients and with ourselves is raising that vital force, which allows us to go from being suboptimal to being a better version of ourselves, generally, or more optimal version of ourselves. So my intuition told me I'm onto something here. I changed my flights, flew to Moscow, went to an extension of that clinic. It is as a Lancet clinic founded by the current prime minister in Russia for his wife, an absolutely beautiful holistic clinic with different health modalities. And I spent 10 days in a row and breathed every day, every morning on an empty stomach. Went back to Switzerland, flew back to Russia, did another couple of sessions, so a total of 14 sessions, after which I could swim underwater again, butterfly, and it was unbelievable. So literally, not only my lungs were better, but my joie de vivre, I had no more depression, no more lethargy. But what it really did is it shed a completely new light on health. We humans tend to, unfortunately, at times conceptualize systems, health systems, vertically, as I say. So the gut, the brain, the skin, the gut, the brain, the immune system. So understanding that everything is intimately intertwined. The mind and emotions are harder to conceptualize, but we understand conceptually that they can impact, and they do impact, our biology by altering cell signals and cellular behavior. And therefore, it's terrain medicine. So it's a very subtle marriage blend between emotions and, of course, the gut. It's a chicken and the egg. No one truly knows what begins where, but all we know is it's like an eight. It's a subtle intertwining.
So a quick clarification. So can you describe how the technology specifically works? Do you breathe through a tube or a mask, or what's happening?
Thank you. It goes in the mouth, and you're generally asked to try to fall asleep, to rest, ideally to breathe through the nose, as we know, and to try to relax. It's a form of siesta or meditation. That's what we encourage our patients or people to do. And to relax and to train. So you're training while you rest. So what's actually extraordinary is that by doing that, you're creating a reorganization, as it were, through cellular surprise of these mitochondria that with age become more and more disgraceful. As we know, everything becomes hard as we age. Inflammation gets trapped, inflammation becomes chronic, enzymes go to sleep, and more poor mitochondria take over the good ones. But the beauty in naturopathic medicine or in terrain medicine, we actually look at how we can reorganize that cellular behavior. Now, I was talking about the vertical aspect of axis. Mitochondria is harder to conceptualize because it's everywhere, in every one of us, in every cell. And of course, as we know now, from cold plunging to fasting to any form of hormesis is really essentially there to reignite that software deep within, or maybe even the hardware. And what the Soviets had understood in the early 60s, the Soviet scientists, the research goes back actually a long way. And the Soviet, what you need to understand is that, of course, Big Pharma did not exist back then. So what you had researchers working hand in, who were often clinicians, or working hand in hand with clinicians. So you didn't have this quite absurd Western divide where you have research carried out in labs, and of course, and then the way that's carried out can be discussed separately, and then the implementation with specific guidelines. So you have, again, the notion of family at your event early July, the notion of transversality. So the Soviets think conceptually a bit the way a tree functions and share, and were applying that. So they worked initially on their pilots. Most of the research was on astronaut pilots and elite military and athletes. So they worked on the pilots, and then they were preparing the athletes for the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico. So they took the athletes, took them up to the Caucasus, to the mountains, and trained them in altitude. Lo and behold, when the athletes came down, they won almost every gold medal in Mexico. Most of the research was kept hush till the early 90s, and then a couple of Soviet then, or Russian doctors came to Germany and introduced the technology to Germany, translating a lot of the research into German. So currently, IHHT is very widespread in Germany. It's spilled into Austria, in the German part of Switzerland. And I, after that ordeal, took the challenge to educate practitioners, doctors, end users, individuals in the French part of Switzerland, and now in North America.
So how would you compare that to HBOT, which is hyperbaric oxygen and hyperoxygen chambers, which is also said to affect the mitochondria?
course, it does. The two are complementary. I believe, again, in a circuit. And most people searching for IHHT, of the way I did first, hear about hyperbaric chamber. How do I compare? Look, in some ways, they're very similar. And in actually, in many ways, they're very different. Because HBOT is essentially going to, through increased oxygen, transform, of course, the mitochondria. But you need to, want to accept to be in a chamber. So that's not for everyone. Most people who are very anxious have difficulty doing it, even if the chambers have improved. And also, as we know, oxygen, there's a flip side to it. Too much oxygen, too many free radicals. So HBOT is used a lot with wound healing, with diving accidents. So they're very specific cases when delivering that much oxygen yields beautiful therapeutic results. With IHHT, it's a notion of less is more and a notion of cellular surprise. So for me, my understanding of it at this stage at least is that IHHT fits more within the realm of hormesis. So you're essentially creating that shock, that up and down, that surprise. And you're taking someone in real time from sea level or below the sea, 36% hyperoxia, up to a window of 9 to 15% hypoxia. So you starve the cells a bit of oxygen. You give it normoxia, 21%, what we generally tend to breathe, or hyperoxia, more oxygen. And it's diapason, that shift, that window between high and low, based on the subject, of course, the individual and how healthy that person is. So it's iteration, repetition, and that fourchette between being up there and being down there that creates a surprise and a reorganization intracellularly, allowing for the birth of new healthy mitochondria to appear. We'll do it, but I believe that HBOT should be used more. I believe both should be used in alternates, but I think that HBOT one could overdo with hyperbaric chamber therapy. Whereas with IHHT, if you're gentle, and this is the key, if you're gentle and ready to give it enough time, and that's, of course, the big challenge because we humans tend to want to rush things, especially when we start feeling initial benefits, then you can do that more as terrain medicine. So IHHT is, for me, more of a tool that could be deployed both by biohackers as well as medical practitioners, functional practitioners, integrative doctors. It can be used to prepare for any aesthetic operation. It can be used to lower downtime. So the applications are extremely broad. The challenge is educating people on what is the mitochondria and how it can be used.
So HBOT takes you into pressure by going low altitude in a way, like going deep. And with IHHT, you are taking the person into high altitude conditions and then alternating between hypoxia and hyperoxia. So then this hyperoxygenated state, is it actually possible to simulate high altitude? Is there some benefit that you're getting actually by going into high altitude hiking instead of doing this with a device like this?
I'd answer it this way. Empirically, yes, because the sheer fact of going and living in the mountains or training in the mountains will be beneficial. But the beauty here is it's that up and down. And that's where the discovery is fascinating. Because in real time, we can't cancel out that time effect and take someone and create that surprise. You can go and do what you need to do or want to do in the mountains and vice versa by the sea. But you can't create that surprise, which is essentially the discovery of IHHT, in other words. There are virtues of naturally going and also training in the mountains. But again, whenever we enter any one state, be it in food, be it in anything, it's that flow, it's that surprise, it's that ebb and flow that creates surprise. It's even, again, like with food, we're creatures of habits. We tend to repeat good or bad habits. But we're noticing now that the more we vary, the more we feed different families of bacteria, the more we make the immune system more resilient to unwanted guests. So by strengthening the host. So it's the same vision here.
Right. So you mentioned enhancing mitochondrial functions. I assume this is very good in conditions involving mitochondrial dysfunction. And I know that it's also used complementary in chronic conditions, anything from cardiovascular health to enhance vascular function to boosting immune system function, modulating it, making the body more resilient to stressors and maybe even improvements in physical performance. So can you talk about this a little bit?
In the former Soviet Union right now, they're using it a lot with long COVID and they're using it with immune dysfunction. But it's used a lot to prepare athletes to conditions and to help them repair. In other words, again, we talk a lot about homeostasis. we don't talk enough about allostasis, which I think is a very beautiful term, which means how to enhance adaptation in the face of change. And that's where plants such as adaptogens do the same thing. They resist the harshest conditions and develop a wherewithal, an intelligence at the cellular level, which is then passed on to our cells. Same thing with IHHT. IHHT will, through a variety of different mechanisms, disactivate certain pathways, activate other pathways, just to keep it really simple in terms of language today, and support the body's ability to cope with stresses. One of my mentors in Southern Oregon in the US used to tell me there's very little that separates an advanced cancer patient from an elite athlete in terms of inflammation, which is fascinating. So because you know how too much of a good thing, for example, and this is the big issue with sports, with Ironman and people who push themselves to such extremes, the body breaks down faster than it repairs. And that catabolic state takes over the anabolic state as we get older. And the beauty here is that with IHHT, we have a truly regenerative approach. So we're not in a substitutive approach, which also yields benefits, such as bioidentical hormone replacement therapy used by colleagues of mine, where you come in and you can slow down the aging process, but you need to constantly continue. With IHHT, the beauty is you can cycle the treatments and then take breaks the way I did. And the results build up. But of course, with wear and tear and with the stresses that come with life and exogenous stresses, emotional, physical, physiological, environmental, the body will need another course. But again, I will only recommend to my loved ones, friends, patients, and including myself, to take breaks and then to come back. And you were talking about hyperoxia and hypoxia, but there's also another program there, which is actually normoxia, which is taking the person down to sea level. So when you have a chronically compromised patient who comes to you, be it a long COVID, be it someone coming from the mental health environment, because we speak a lot about athletes, but we don't speak enough about addictions, for example. And this works really well, IHHT, with addictions, because it through microcirculation and through a variety of pathways, it accelerates and enhances the production of different neurotransmitters. And as we know, we're made of molecules. We're molecules of emotions, to paraphrase Candace Pert. And we really are that. And then we generate a certain vibration, and then we're physical beings and energetic beings. But what's intriguing is that dopamine, serotonin, noradrenaline, catechol, I mean, you name it, all this interplay, this marriage of molecules that we know now is produced in a holographic manner, be it here or here, we can, through IHHT, activate certain pathways, allowing a person who does not want to change his or her diet, who might not be able to give up, who might not be able to absorb the various different supplements and herbs given in various forms, powdered, liquid, tinctures, you name it, capsule form. Okay, so now you've got a trend for IVs, but here you're entering a sphere where, sure, IVs will work, and IVs are, how can I say, directly absorbed, you circumnavigate the gut, etc. But the truth is, IH can be included in one's routine or lifestyle with breaks as a support and as an ability for most of us to get the benefits of that surprise sea levels. To come back to your initial question, I still believe, like a supplement is only a supplement to high quality food, it is not going to replace going and spending several hours or several days or several months up in Zermatt and going for long walks. But it will allow for that surprise that we might not get if we go and spend too much time in the mountains or forget about the sea. That's what I'm trying to say. And then also what's beautiful here, and this then opens up a new area, which is binding IHHT with different health modalities, such as vibrational medicine or music. And this is what I've done in Geneva, and I'm exporting this concept now to medical practice in Belgium next month, and then in a spa context in Lisbon by the end of the year to reach different demo. What I noticed after Moscow is I went to Germany. I was introduced to a German doctor, originally Russian, took a device, brought it home, and spent about 9 months breathing at home and experimenting on myself first, and then introducing it to a few friends and loved ones. And what I did is I started using classical music, which I adore, and looking for synergies and noticing that actually I got enhanced benefits by combining music with the breathing. And then that led me to think about how can I integrate and create a multisensorial, or what I call a Swiss immersion, just an immersion at a sensorial level where a person can breathe, listen to specific music, which will then enhance that relaxation mode, which will enable the person to switch off, to train whilst resting. So in other words, you repair, rejuvenate whilst you rest. It's actually quite intriguing. And now we're including also some red light therapy. The idea is really to ignite the mitochondria but without overdoing it. Because some practitioners are going to use a massage chair. I think that when you're overly stimulated, then it actually has a counter effect. So my idea is really to get people in that lounging position, to disconnect from their stresses, to reconnect to the music of their soul. And it's intriguing because through homeostasis or allostasis, each person will tell me, look, first, a person might not feel any differences for 3 to 4 sessions. And all of a sudden say, you know what? My sleep has changed, or I have less appetite, or I don't want to eat foods anymore. So it's working. So it goes where it needs to go first. In my case, it went and fixed the lungs. In someone else's case, it's going to work on a metabolic level. So it works with weight management. For someone else, it's going to work on joint health. And for someone else, it's going to work on addictions, to sugar, to gaming, to different forms of substances. And that's where we realized that we need to become one's own detective, and we can actually learn to decipher the language, the signs, the signals that our body's yearning to express. And when we become cleaner, I said, the body speaks in a different language to us, and we actually can trust those messages.
It sounds like it will enhance microcirculation, so it probably makes synergistically more effective the actual treatment by involving this vibrational therapy, frequency therapy. So I would imagine that. Now, what are the kind of clinical applications of IHHT? You said you went to Russia to get this treatment in the first place. So what is this like traditionally used in terms of different conditions? And then to move into more performance enhancement territory with someone who doesn't have an existing condition, why would someone do IHHT specifically?
So it was discovered in Russia. It was, as I mentioned, developed in Germany. So these are the two countries that are really at the forefront of it right now. In Russia, it's still not that well known, believe it or not, because what happened is a lot of the funding stopped for a few decades. And now there's a new interest that's appeared because more and more people are realizing that the world has clearly changed, at least this reality. And many are looking for a way to get back the quality of life that they've had, or to improve the quality of life generally, or to repair, or to get better post-vaccine connected to the COVID or post-COVID. To answer you, in Russia, for example, autism is understood as a mitochondrial disease, which is not something that we perceive the same way in the Western world of vernacular. So what happens is that in Russia, you have clinics, or at least I know of one, that uses IHHT synergistically with other therapies to support at the mitochondrial level people suffering from autism. It's used mainly right now in specific clinics for long COVID. And as we know, long COVID is essentially an umbrella word for people having been affected at a mitochondrial level. That's why some people were hit neurologically, others were hit in terms of energy levels. So in other words, each person was hit in a different way. Some people don't even notice it, and then it's cardiovascular, it's silent, and they're hit with a stroke. So what's fascinating is that people now who realize, let's say, if it's because they understand and they feel that they're suboptimal, they realize that they're not as good as their conventional lab work would tell them that they are with a conventional medical doctor. They realize, whom do I trust? That sheet of paper or my body that's sending signals that something's off? So in Russia, it's still used medically. It hasn't entered the wellness sphere. In Germany, the story is different. It's mostly used by naturopaths. It's used by now more and more clinics. It's used by medical doctors. It's used, I believe, in Berlin, if I'm not mistaken, at the Freie Hospital with long COVID. So it's gaining more and more credence because let's not forget that in 2019, the 3 Nobel Prizes of medicine demonstrated the scientific principles that undergird hypoxia. Now, the West, once again, confirms with its tools and language what not even the ancients here, but let's say their Soviet counterpart, colleagues, scientists, 3 or 4 decades earlier had already understood and published about. So there are more articles on PubMed coming out on the application. So it's used, and now certain clinics, there's one in Zurich, using it, as I mentioned, for addictions. Currently, the applications are mostly to prepare athletes in Germany. I think soccer teams are using it, or people who've been affected. My aim is, with this Million Minds mission that I've created, I don't know if you're familiar with this, so the idea is to educate 1 million people across the globe and to whisper health treasures from the East, namely from Siberia to a Western ear, and vice versa from the West to the East. I want information to travel freely without any geographical boundaries, no frontiers. And my aim here is to really bring it into a wellness sphere, and it can be really deployed as a standalone, the way people go and have IVs in the lounge, but it can also be integrated by different health professionals, medical alternatives. So let's say integrative practitioners prior to operation to help. Because remember, our ability to recuperate from any form of operation or intervention depends on our, again, ability to lower chronic inflammation and the ability the body has of entering an anabolic state, shifting back into the middle. It's never one or the other. It's a constant dance. It's an ebb and flow. And by supporting mitochondrial health, we generally have a better reservoir, a better ability to come back to the middle, to the center, to find one center faster. So my aim is to offer it as a plug and play, let's say, in different medical clinics to show clinicians the importance of thinking along the lines of mitochondria, but to do it in a fun and dynamic way. Not because, this is very important, it's changing very recently right now in Russia, but 3 years ago when I did it, I was actually lying down horizontally. It's in Germany that I was told, no, you shouldn't lie down because if you fall asleep and your tongue goes back, and some people suffer from sleep apnea, which is actually my case, people have that issue happen, it can actually, you can't actually enter that state, and the effects can be negative. So you need to be in a lounging position. Now the Russians actually learned from the Germans. So the information is traveling back to Russia from Germany, where we're understanding the importance of being in a relaxed manner, in a relaxed form. So to answer you, the research on IHHT and the mitochondria is there. It's growing every year. The clinical applications have not yet been, it hasn't been yet fully endorsed by the West and by the Russians and deployed the way I'd like it to be deployed across the board. Because regenerative medicine is, as we know, not about disease management, but it's about building health and celebrating vitality. So it's one has to convince the practitioners that, first and foremost, what counts is that patient's health and outcome. The patient is at the epicenter of the journey.
So if you would take something that doesn't require a device, like a chamber or a mask with massive machinery next to it to run it, if you would use a method like the Wim Hof method that also claims to work on this hypoxia, hyperoxia, how would you compare the effects of something like Wim Hof method with breathing alterations and its comparison to this technique?
I believe that there are similarities. I must admit that I need to jump into the Wim Hof method. I believe that it will be a great add-on. I'm already sleeping with a mask at night, taping my mouth because of my sleep apnea and using IHHT during the day. And I've been reading and listening to Wim Hof, and it's going to be the next discovery of mine. But to answer you, I believe that they're crossovers, but I might answer this in a non-academic way here. I really believe it all depends on what the person believes in. And I see many friends, people I know who jumped into the Wim Hof method and it's changed their lives. I met recently in Florida, Sarasota, where I was giving a talk at one of my colleagues and friends conferences, Dr. Laurence, actually, who you know, John Laurence, who was actually in Helsinki, whom I met in Helsinki, who asked me to introduce to a circle of practitioners and friends of his and patients of his. I met a gentleman who offers this activation breath work. And what's fascinating is I believe that on one's life journey, we have hooks and moments where we're ready to absorb and take on new health modalities. Some people will tell you, look, I can do it without a mask. I can just do it. But to answer you, I believe that the Wim Hof method through hormesis will do something similar to IHHT, the way activation breathwork does, which is from a holotropic breathing. But will it, again, it depends on the belief system, I believe, of the person, what they really want to do. Some people don't want to have tools and artifacts. Other people would rather lie down and offer themselves that parenthesis, that ritual, where they breathe. And in the way we've devised longevity, which is the name of the concept, we then marry it with music and with red light now to create this triad. So I believe it's HBOT, that there are different ways of skinning the cat. I don't think, and we're working on microcirculation, oxygenation, and on the mitochondria. We're just doing it from different angles. And again, I think that neither IHHT alone, Wim Hof methods alone, holotropic breathing alone holds all the secrets. So it's really about varying. I really believe in varying it. So ideally, we'd have centers where people would come in and experience different circuits. And then you also have to listen to what they're drawn towards, because I can present what I believe in, But you might actually say, Karim, thank you very much, but I don't need any masks. I can do it by breathing. And if I'm trying to convince you through a rational prism, I'm failing a priori. I have to respect your belief system when you're coming from. That's at least the way I've always been. That's the way I think as a practitioner and as a person.
So to me, it sounds like when it comes to IHHT, let's say compared to Wim Hof method, both have effects on mental health, feeling of vitality, energy, mitochondrial function, the ability of the lungs to utilize oxygen and also resist CO2. I think the CO2 resistance is also another effect, and I would consider that this is an adaptogen in a way.
And remember, this is the beauty of it. This is an embryonic process that occurs when we're in the womb. So we have hypoxic states, as Dr. Arkady Prokopov mentioned recently in an interview with Joseph McCullough. And it's really fascinating because we actually reignite, we're essentially reactivating a process known to us in utero. So in other words, this hypoxic state is something known to us that we're rediscovering. So we're going back to, it's a bit like Watsu used with autism. There's a shatsu in the water. I don't know if you're familiar with this, where you go back and you make certain sounds, and you go back and you essentially go back into the mother's womb. And it's fascinating because always when I'm lying on these floating boats now, these are sensations that we once knew that we're rediscovering. So IHHT will then activate also the production of CO2. There's a variety of hitherto unknown chains of molecular reactions that occur through IHHT, and similarly with Wim Hof's method and other methods. But again, these are crossovers because this is very complex. Mitochondria are mysterious ancient bacteria that have co-evolved with us and that actually in many ways precede us. So who's the host and who's the guest? That's also the topic for another podcast. Are we the guests? Are we the wanted or unwanted guests welcomed by the mitochondria? And this is really the vision in naturopathy was fascinating me. Instead of going after the bad guys in the gut, why not support our friends and allies? By supporting them, we change the intelligence of that microbiome, as we call it now, but we have different biomes, as we know. So we support families of allies that then keep the unwanted guests in check. So we don't need to resort to power. And this could actually be used in world affairs, I imagine, and applied to top politicians' philosophy, if only they could deploy a naturopathic outlook where you look at that whole pain, as you said. And that's the beauty of the adaptogens speak directly to the hypothalamus. They go straight up there. And then there is the chain of effects and not organ specific.
So let's define adaptogen. Adaptogens, in a short way to think about, is your body's ability to adapt to stress. The term was coined in 1947 by a Russian scientist called Dr. Nikolai Lazarev. He introduced this term to describe substances that enhance the state of non-specific resistance to stress. Later, his definition was, I would say, recognized, but also more accurately defined through research in Soviet Union by people like Dr. Israel Brecham. And one way to think about it, it's non-specific, so it increases body's resistance to a wide range of stressors. Then there's a normalizing effect. It stabilizes the influence on bodily systems, and it is non-toxic, so it shouldn't disturb normal body functions, even in long-term use. For example, great changes in blood pressure or heart rate and so on. And I've used adaptogens for a long time. Different types of substances, and many biohackers do, like some of the most common adaptogens in terms of herbal products. What people use is rhodiola, rosea, which is I think also sometimes called as rose root. It's the northern version or Siberian version of something like ginseng. It's not really a ginseng, but just like ginseng, which is another of these adaptogenic plants that have effect on energy metabolism and oxygen utilization. That's a really interesting one. In India, they use ashwagandha or Withania somnifera, which also has effects on oxygen utilization. And then there's a specific mushroom that a lot of people use for energy. It's called cordyceps, that also improves oxygen uptake. Personally, I've received a lot of benefits from all of these. If I just summarize some of my own experiences, I like to use ginseng, especially for its blood sugar stabilizing effect. So in a way, like if I want to have good focus, often it's not about stimulating myself, like many people do caffeine or other substances and stimulants. To me, something like ginseng with its blood sugar regulating effects is quite great. Ashwagandha, on the other hand, its effect on the reduction of stress hormones, especially morning cortisol, is one of the reasons why I use it. And rhodiola, I've noticed that if I do something like a physical exercise, like a gym workout, it feels less painful. For example, I would feel like if I do a set of weightlifting, like the last set feels less straining on my system in some way. And cordyceps, on the other hand, it works very similarly to caffeine on the adenosine receptors, the cordycepin specifically in it. And I've noticed with cordyceps that it's a pretty good alternative to caffeine if one wants to reduce caffeine intake. Cordyceps can give similar effects. It also does disturb sleep through similar mechanisms. But there's interesting studies and effects on it on VO2 max. And I think anyone who is trying to improve oxygen utilization, VO2 max, which is also one of those things that from a longevity standpoint is actually one of the most proven methods. If you improve your VO2 max, you will have higher likelihood of having a longer health span. And so that's where oxygen utilization comes into play for me specifically. And there's many other adaptogens that are often categorized like Schisandra or holy basil or tulsi. But to me, adaptogens are like, if you think of stimulants are like spiking and then there's some kind of crash, while adaptogens are giving this resistance. So if you're understimulated, it will stimulate you enough. And if you're overstimulated, it will regulate that. So that's my kind of refined understanding of it. And we wrote quite extensively about adaptogens, for example, in the Biohackers handbook that we published back in the day. It's available from biohackerscenter.com. But yeah, can you speak a little bit about adaptogens?
Actually, first of all, I'd like to thank you for having compared IHHT, or actually coined IHHT an adaptogen, or at least raise the possibility of understanding IHHT. And it really is. I just want to go back one second to IHHT and then read the link with it. So when my patients are telling me, and when I exchange with colleagues, they all tell me that we want to eat less. We feel more zen. Our perception of a situation shifts. So there's a very interesting internal reorganization of our inner, what I call this mosaic of happiness or inner architecture that we have. And it's interesting because one's perception of situations and of people change and one doesn't need as much food because you actually are fed at the mitochondrial level differently. When I discovered adaptogens, we're going back 17 years, I was mentored by a wonderful gentleman, and I hope he hears this podcast, Donnie Yance in Southern Oregon, in a beautiful city called Ashland in Southern Oregon, very close to between Portland and San Francisco. And I discovered in Southern Oregon the virtues of Siberian adaptogen. So I want to just go back a second on the historical development of that and then talk about why and how they work and the beauty. And then we can maybe, discuss this together in a further chat because it's a minefield. I actually lectured on them in April of 2018 in Monte Carlo at the Anti-Aging Conference about the role of Siberian adaptogens in stress mitigation. And I'd love to be able to talk about that more. During the Cold War, there were these two blocks. Americans were taking elite athletes, elite military, and astronauts and boosting them. So it was all about, as you talk about the caffeine, it was all about boosting performance. Again, it's a philosophical outlook. The Soviets, thanks to Lazarev, Breckman, exactly, and then their teams, were working on the same groups during the Cold War. And they thought, hold on a second, is it really about boosting or is it about enhancing adaptation? So when astronauts come back, how are they going to adapt to being back? Elite athletes, when they got same thing. And again, this is where the whole IHHT thing came up about 10, 15 years later. It's a philosophy. It's a Weltanschauung. It's an outlook on life, which is completely different. So Lazarev started noticing there was a family of herbs growing in the pristine Siberian highlands, which he then coined adaptogens. And he broke it down in different groups, primary, secondary, companion adaptogens. But that we can discuss maybe in a separate chat. And what's beautiful is that he realized that these herbs had a unique ability in the plant kingdom of resisting Siberian winters of that period. Now, Siberian winters in the late 40s and 50s were not today's winters, as we know. So they were able to survive the harshest conditions. And then he posited that, hold on, if they have the intelligence, the ability, the capacity to resist our winters, what happens if we give them to the astronauts, to the military, to the athletes? Could they maybe pass on pharmacokinetic properties, so properties, molecules, principles, to our cells, and then help with the way we humans or these groups would adapt to different stresses? Because again, it's not stress per se that kills us, and Hans Selye talks about it. It's stress, when stress shifts into distress, when the brain perceives stress as a threat versus one's ability to perceive a situation. Again, it's all about perception, I imagine. And here, Lazarev realized that these herbs were also growing in China. Why am I talking about this extensively? Because pharmacokinetically, the herbs are identical, some of them. But from a therapeutic standpoint, the results are completely different. So then we realized, and Lazarev realized actually and his team, that maybe we're talking about something beyond tangible, measurable molecules. We're talking about the energetics of the herbs, what Claude Bernard called the milieu, but also the environment of where these plants grow. The Chinese counterparts do not grow where they don't have the same environment, so epigenetics here. So to what extent the conditions affect the intelligence of the herbs through hormesis and stress and a struggle for survival, they end up thriving. The strongest survive, thrive, and then that intelligence, that wisdom, alongside the measurable, tangible pharmacokinetic properties are passed on to those humans or to us humans. And there's a transfer of intelligence, which then creates a shift in our internal terrain as we know our cells speak to one another, the way two musical notes do. The same here, God expresses himself or herself through Mother Nature and the plant kingdom. And when these plants are passed on, they create that change in our environment, making our terrain more resistant, more resilient. So this is terrain medicine. Again, it enhances allostasis, how to adapt in the face of change, and of course, homeostasis. This is where IHHT works exactly the same way. When I discovered this, I noticed that my appetite, my patient's appetite would shift. And one of the keys to the successful results that I had initially in my practice was rather than change someone's diet, because most people don't want to change their diet, as we know, is actually helping them organically change taste buds. So if you can actually create a shift in that internal milieu, a person will perceive sweet things or carbs or whatever habits they have in a different light. They might not even want them anymore. And also they go, hold on a second, what's happening? I'm changing at a very deep and subtle level. And that's generally done when you get the help from a regenerative standpoint, things such as IHHT, which I recently discovered, or adaptogens. So all this work was, again, kept hush-hush until in the early 90s. And then a gentleman by the name of Tabashnik, originally from Azerbaijan, from Baku, who was working in Moscow with a team of scientists, and again, preparing the athletes of this time, not the 1960 Mexico Olympic Games, but the if I'm not mistaken, 88 Korea Seoul Olympic Games. And one of the methods used was introducing adaptogens in that preparation. Yellow pterococcus, which is what we call the Siberian ginseng. There's also a fantastic herb that we hear much less about in Europe. And again, Donny Jans introduced us to it. And I'll share with you the line of supplements device, which is done, we know, with beautiful ethics. And actually, he receives the herbs. Even today, despite the political situation in the world, I found out he's found a way to receive them from the Far East, from Vladivostok. So Tabashnik Ben moved to San Francisco in 1990 and became a supplier of adaptogens to this master herbalist and clinical nutritionist who works in the field of integrative ecology or collaborative ecology in Oregon. Donny, so Jans is his name, Y-A-N-C-E. So Tabashnik started supplying Donny with these herbs. And Donny, when he was mentoring us, was teaching us something really beautiful, which is that many people jump into these heroic detoxifications, which has been trendy for so many decades now, etc. But as we know, some people go and fast and collapse when they start fasting too quickly, too intensively. Others do much better. So there is the notion of metabolic or biochemical individuality, to paraphrase Williams, and also emotional individuality. People have different terrains, but they also have different life forces. And this is what's interesting. If we actually start by approaching not only ourselves, our loved ones, or for clinicians, our patients, by supporting the vital force, we start by raising a person's vitality, and that's where adaptogens work, and that's where IHHT works beautifully. By supporting the vital force, we change the terrain, and then we have a cellular detoxification that occurs but it isn't a heroic, or as Arne calls it, a honeymoon effect, where we get a wow effect, which then generally comes with the counter response. So the idea is we do something more gradual, but something more intelligent because it's constant. Coming back to what you mentioned in your beautiful introduction, Teemu, adaptogens speak straight to the head, to the conductor. So some people will call the thyroid the conductor, others will call it the hypothalamus. There are different schools of thought here, but what we know is that we have an axis, which is unlike the mitochondria, which is diffuse and everywhere, which is vertical here, which goes from the brain, from the hypothalamus, speaks to the pituitary, speaks to the thyroid, and speaks to the adrenals. It's a concerto. When we send a signal, if it's not a wrong-headed one, if it's an honest and noble one, the hypothalamus will send different signals or healthy signals downstream. As it speaks to each gland, the ability of us producing different hormones changes. And as we know, we're made of molecules. It's a subtle synergy among minerals, vitamins, bacteria, fungus, viruses, and of course, hormones. Hormones give orders to the cell. So if you look at hormone therapy through the prism of allostasis or the prism of adaptogenic, and if we look at it through the prism of adaptogenic remedies, we actually have a very gentle form of hormone balancing therapy, which takes you up to a certain point. Then, of course, it's a question of positioning. We regard aging as a disease, or do we regard aging as something that occurs, but occurs in a graceful manner, that can occur in a graceful manner? In which case, you might want to continue with the adaptogens and the regenerative approaches versus taking other forms of treatments. Then it's very much a personal positioning vis-a-vis life, death, aging, and one's philosophical stance. So adaptogens, yes, have the ability to speak to the hypothalamus in a non-specific manner, and therefore in a very subtle but also integrated way of going to the root. Because if the brain gets the right signal, downstream, it will help balance hormones naturally. And of course, have an effect on brain chemistry, and naturally on taste buds, and therefore on self-perception, and therefore on happiness, and therefore on mind over body. So this is where you're realizing that by borrowing molecules from the plant kingdom and the energetics from them, you can actually create, and also borrowing from their life struggle or their struggle with death. So in other words, through their struggle with hormesis, as it were, we actually go back and create that ebb and flow, that ate, and then likewise we produce new emotions, new thought patterns, which then speak down to the biology. And that's when it's a dance. And that's what's really beautiful. So adaptogens, yes. But the question is, which ones? How are they administered? Are we using the schizandra leaves or the berries? And then you have different traditions. And I'd love to be able to discuss this more with you and share more with you and with the audience, because there are different qualities, as we know, of supplements out there and herbs. And also there's the ethics of how they've been harvested, how they've been passed on, and how they've been compounded. And it's the intention in the supplement line. And that's really, I think, quite beautiful. I use tinctures as well, but I rotate. And I noticed something very similar. Thank you for having actually opened my eyes on that. I hadn't thought about IHHT as an adaptogen. I was using other word. No, thank you for that, because you actually crystallized it beautifully. But the fact of being able to go off food for long periods of sometimes hours and sometimes a day or two without having sugar imbalances, without having dips, without feeling jittery, and realizing that you're fed by the plant kingdom or by what I call cellular surprise. I like the notion of cellular surprise because it's gentle and it's really what IHHT is all about.
Yeah. So if we go back into the different practical applications of adaptogens, and thank you very much for acknowledging the fact that IHHT can be also considered as an adaptogen. Rhodiola rosa, or I mentioned rose root, also another term is golden root. The Soviets actually used that, especially with athletes, soldiers, and astronauts. There is some literature on the use of astronauts to be able to sustain radiation in space and also like recover faster once they come back from their space missions. Also, the Russians used elueth or the Siberian ginseng, and that's pretty powerful substance as well, and it was used in athletes and workers also in demanding environments. And then Schisandra sinensis, which is the Schisandra which I love. I think the Chinese name translates to something like five tastes, because it has like everything from all the different taste components. savory, salty, sweet. It's just like a beautiful taste. I think it's one of the best tasting of all of these adaptogens because most of them taste horrible. And then there's, of course, the Asian ginseng, which in Chinese medicine is a big thing, which is Panax ginseng, and there's different forms. But a lot of these are roots. Also, the root of Wheathania somnifera or ashwagandha is as well. So many of these plants, they produce these protective compounds when they are attacked in nature. So that's where most of these beneficial compounds come from. So it's like their natural immune system, partly these compounds that they produce. And then when we take them in, they also have a response in the body and often by its immune system that leads to these positive adaptations. Now, those are some of the most well-known. And of course, functional mushrooms or medicinal mushrooms, like some like to call them, although the modern medicine doesn't want to acknowledge them as medicine. That's why functional mushrooms is maybe a bit more neutral term. Also have many of them have these effects, like I mentioned, cordyceps. But there are also some more rare and lesser known, especially Soviet or Russian adaptogens that are not on the market as visibly. Right. One of them is the marrow root, for example.
The marrow root, there's a period, if I'm not mistaken, it's in June, where you could actually, now for all those of you listening to us today, this might sound a little bit surprising to a Western ear, but there's a tradition in Russia of going, namely in Siberia. Remember, a lot of it comes from Siberia. That's really the hotbed for most of the science, be it in the quantum field, what the Germans call, or the Westerners call bioresonance, or be it in the Hubble medicine kingdom field as well, or let's say regenerative medicine. There's a period of 3 weeks in June where you can go and take baths with the big moose, the morels, horns to the blood. Now, I experienced this in Kazakhstan more than a decade ago. A friend of mine was traveling there, and we had the dried powder of the horns used, and it had a huge effect on blood pressure. Actually, a different effect than when you actually take that. It's known as pantocrine is the word, which is used as a libido enhancer or stimulant when you take it orally. Then when you take it transdermally in a bath, it has effects on blood pressure. So it's, again, the results all come from the dose. The morale is fascinating because it has really noticeable effects on microcirculation, and some call it the sort of natural Viagra. But which, by the way, IHHT is also coined the natural Viagra. Because when you improve microcirculation, blood flows to the extremities. So the brain starts functioning differently, and so do other parts of the body.
I would imagine a lot of these adaptogens, they work synergistically with IHHT by during the session also, because it's a form of stress, right? So it probably helps to adapt to that a little bit and maybe also recover from if there's any fatigue from those kind of therapy sessions.
The way I conceived longevity here was really trying to bring it down to the simple bare bones of mitochondrial support with IHHT, the red light, and of course the music together as a triad. But the idea is that when people breathe and stop, you maintain them generally with adaptogens. And that's what I've started doing here, rather than doing it synergistically. But it's a great idea to actually bring it in to the circuit. There's another plant that I want to talk about, a herb, also known in Russia and poorly known in the West, known as Roponticum. This is the Latin name, cartamoides. Roponticum cartamoides contains a fascinating molecule known as which from a structural perspective, it's quasi-identical to cortisol. So when you take it, I'll send you after this talk some more information about it. The brain, when we absorb the phytoectosterols present in the roponticum, the brain will manage stress differently because it's essentially producing cortisol differently. In other words, it's really, and it works on VO2 max. So we generally take it for 20 days, take a 10-day break. And we notice, be it a physiological stress, workouts, be it travel as I do and jet lags and adapting, be it the radiation from planes, be it toxic people we know interact with if we're sensitive or not. So in other words, the body is able to, once again, we're fed differently. In other words, we take new decisions and we're able to recover. Again, the anabolic phase improves. And so you talk about the variety of positive effects of adaptogens. They work on microcirculation. They work on COX-2, LOX-5. So they work on different on cell signaling. So they reduce specific pathways. They work on so many, I don't want to get too technical here, pathways, but in short, they reduce the inflammation. They improve the ability of finding one center faster, shifting back into an anabolic state. So they're enhancing, but what they also do, and this is what I think really maybe at the epicenter of what I want to say, we borrow from the plant kingdom what we need to find one center, and each person has a different way of finding that balance. In other words, the brain and body are extremely well designed. They're going to borrow exactly what they need and flush out what they don't. In other words, the same. And I often had this from Middle Eastern or Russian patients tell me, but Karim, you have a personalized way, a boutique way of approaching the health journeys, but why am I getting the same tincture with the same herbs as my cousin or my brother or my relative? We're different. And I'd say, yes, but let's understand individuality in a different way. Your body and your cousins, your friends, your relatives will borrow in that tincture and the synergy of different herbs, what it needs to balance, which in your case will be very different to your neighbors or relatives. So in other words, the notion of individuality also has to be taken into perspective, because the body being a beautiful self-regulating organism, it knows what to borrow in rhodiola, what to borrow in chisandra, what to borrow in chaga, what to borrow in the pantocrine. And again, the same dose, the same herb alone, single herb, mono herb, versus the same synergy will work differently in different people. But what we're noticing is that people are less hungry. People are noticing the way exactly. So food can come from a different source. And I think that's really what we can understand even philosophically.
There's this appetite suppressing effect, and I would say it's like probably because of the blood sugar regulating aspects of this. And so it's quite amazing if you want to focus long periods of time on something and do it resiliently. These adaptogens can help for sure.
I'd like also to regard or consider the Bacopa monnieri. I don't know how familiar you are with this Ayurvedic.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
My favorite. The Brahmi plant used in Ayurvedic medicine. Most of the studies are in India.
That's a blood flow plant. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a mind flow, and it works on a variety of different molecules. And some even argue that it has many of the positive effects of stimulants such as Ritalin and stuff, which I, of course, don't regard highly, but that we can actually work on a variety, on that whole rainbow of brain chemicals, which are also gut chemicals, and each person will need his or her dosage. We generally notice when our ability to adapt is enhanced, that everything is done, there's a finesse through IHHT, a finesse through the plant kingdom that we don't have with pharmaceuticals, which have their role to play. But they're, again, in the philosophy of let's boost, whereas here, let's enhance adaptation, let's improve the response. It's a very different way of thinking.
Yeah, for sure. There's a couple of lesser known plants that I discovered recently. So one of them is called Sagan dahlia. This is a plant that grows in Siberia, especially around Lake Altai. So I met some Russian travelers on my travels, and they offered me this tea, and it's quite powerful, especially in terms of enhancing mental alertness and physical stamina. So it's more, I think it looks like more like these kind of needles or leaves.
Could you share the name again with me, or maybe afterwards?
Sagan dahlia. The Latin name is Rhododendron adamsi. If you haven't heard about it, I recommend checking it out. It's a Siberian or Mongolian tea that is often used as to promote energy and vitality and well-being. And it's definitely a nootropic in some way, in my experience. And it's very stimulating. So often, the Russians that I've met, they recommend to take it easy with it, that you don't take much, just it can lead to overstimulation. So that's one thing. And another plant that I found very interesting also comes from Siberia and Mongolia. It's called the Siberian tea or Mongolian tea. Specifically, the Latin name of this plant is Bergenia crassifolia. And this particular plant is very comparable to rhodiola or Siberian ginseng or Eleuthera in its effects, in my experience. It's a leaf. And funnily enough, when we were writing the Biohackers handbook back in the days, a decade ago, we realized this plant was growing on the yard of the summer cottage we were in. And so we just made some tea out of it. And It's pretty strong adaptogen as well.
Would you take them in the form of teas? Do you take them in the...
Both of them are teas. So many of the adaptogens we spoke about are more like you used it internally and you eat it. But specifically with these two, you make a tea out of it. So if you rather drink a tea, these two plants, Sagandalia and Bergenia grassifolia, is great. In Finnish, I know the name. It's called vuorenkilpi. I don't know what it is in English language, but yeah, there's so many adaptogens that have not been marketed or popularized that can have very interesting effects.
On my next travel, I'm going back. Actually, I'm going to Siberia in October, and I'll try to discover new herbs and plants, which I'd be really ready to share. Because it's, as you said, what's also fascinating is how culturally these plants are part of people's childhood. They grow up with their grandparents serving that to them when they're sick, etc. So many Russians have grown intertwined with the flora and the fauna, much more than, at least in the West. I don't know about Finland, but where we're much more detached. We have to go and study the fauna and the flora. But we grew up, most of us we know, with a Western pharmacopoeia.
Yeah. Very few people have seen these plants. Like they might buy them as supplements, but I have actually collected Rhodiola rosea myself and even grown it in these regions. Like it requires a little bit colder regions. So we live in Finland in the same kind of latitude or longitude of Siberia. So many of these plants do grow here if we want to. Specifically this Siberian tea, Bergenia crassifolia. By the way, I checked. The name in English is often called just Bergenia or leather Bergenia. And the reason why it's called leather, because the leaves are distinctive, thick, and very leathery. So it looks like leather that just grows on ground. And so it's already like when you look at the leaf, it has some serious power. Like it's not a fragile plant at all. And it has this darker color as well. So it looks like super potent. Yeah, I can attest using it as tea that it does work for sure.
With these teas, when you've around as well as a form of companion and
yeah, last time when I came across Sagandalia, that was actually in Thailand. So I met these Russian travelers and they had some, so I got it. And I actually did combine Sagandalia with Blue Lotus, which is another, I don't know if it's an adaptogen, but it has hypnotic effects. Sometimes one could say it's a psychedelic as well. So Blue Lotus tea, which is often made from the Blue Lotus flower, and I combined that with Sagandalia, and the effect was incredible. And I had some friends who tried that out, and it was like somehow very, very beautiful, like stable effect, and it had mood lifting properties also. So yeah, and Blue Lotus is not very well known for a lot of people either, but that's another interesting plant that I've come across.
I'll collect some when I'm in Siberia and send some to you or bring them over next time, because it's true that I receive them in tinctures. And when I'm in Russia, I drink them in the form of teas. And and when I come back, I fall into the Western trap of getting it as an end product, when in fact I should start using more of them in the form of teas. I have Bacopa tea, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, Blue Lotus is... I wouldn't consider that one an adaptogen, but it actually comes from ancient Egypt, and it had medical spiritual applications. It's very kind of euphoric, calming, increases sensuality, and has like dream effects on dreams as well. So you could say that it's a dream herb in some form. But
there's also fascinating research with the alchemical schools of Petra in the old days, and the work on Peganu Harmala. I don't know.
Yeah, Harmala, yes. So that's more of
beta-carbolines, a harmine and pinoline.
Yeah, that's a Mayo inhibitor, right? So some Mayo inhibitors are quite interesting as well. Of course, like that's one of the combinations on some to enhance some other compounds like DMT containing plants.
Exactly. It's fascinating to see plants like that one to contain 5-MeO-DMT to work on activating the pineal gland. And we can actually reach these states by meditating in total darkness. So that means we can endemically produce molecules, which we do when we sleep or dream, by boring them in, finding them in certain plants in the plant kingdom, which is intriguing.
I actually checked Blue Lotus. The active ingredients are apomorphine and nuciferin, and that might explain why Blue Lotus is controlled in some countries.
Finland, you can get it easily in Finland, or you grow it?
In Finland, it's not, I think it's on the medicine list. So in a way, you can't really like order it or bring it over the border. But in Baltics, it is absolutely allowed. For example, in Estonia, I've seen that also often used in cacao ceremonies around the world. Often in cacao ceremonies, they like to combine theobromine or cacao with Blue Lotus. It's a very interesting, if you look at like Apomor, it just from a medical standpoint, it has this relaxing effect. So it can definitely work on mood related things, but also some nervous system issues like Parkinson's. I know that in modern medicine, they use this specifically in purified form. That's why it probably is like controlled, because pharmaceutical industry is making money out of one of its ingredients. But but of course, the addiction potentials and all of that should be considered. Personally, I haven't noticed. It's super mild. But yeah, it's an interesting compound. But with Sagandelia, I noticed like in like small quantities, it was actually a pretty wonderful, relaxing tea that enhanced mood and focus and stamina.
Very interesting. Yeah. The that I made through this Belgian physician who's going to be integrating Dr. Rezim, a very interesting gentleman in Brussels. Who's going to be incorporating IHHT in his practice. I've known Kutsu for people wanting to get off alcohol addictions. But what I found quite interesting was Dr. Rezimo introduced me to the effects of Kutsu on other forms of addiction. For example, when you're going through a breakup, if you're addicted to someone who's toxic in your life, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, it works on plethora of addictions.
I think this term, it sounds I think it's probably from East Asia or something like Japan.
Exactly. And the results have been quite surprising. Again, one needs to find the right dose. And I've seen people perceive situations again differently. Once again, working. So we're not just working through the prism of let's give amino acids, let's build up, neurotransmitters and stuff, but we're also working through that flow, the microcirculation.
Yeah. So this interview has been very comprehensive, holistic in a way, like looking at breathing, looking at altitude, going deep into the ocean briefly with HBOT discussions, looking at the benefits of this altered training where you go up and down in a way, pressure or altitude simulation in a sense, the effects on mitochondria, the effects on adaptation capability, ability to resist stress, basically improving adaptability. There's also these adaptogenic herbs and so external supplementation that one can do to enhance these effects. So there's both natural through breathing or actually doing altitude training to technological that we have discussed as here, and also natural, herbal, and molecules that can enhance these pathways in the human body. And this podcast is sponsored by Tour, which produces medical electronics. They have 100 years of history. They also do offer solutions for IHHT, and also people have probably heard about intermittent hypoxic therapy or IHT specifically. So they have products and brands under that, for example, CellOxy, CellAir One. They also produce shockwave therapy devices that are powerful for sending these powerful therapeutic waves affecting tissues. They have electrotherapy, ultrasound therapy devices, isocinetic therapy devices for rehabilitation, cryotherapy devices, high-frequency devices. Over 100 years of producing these medical electronics. Great company. And so these are also, if someone listening is running a clinic, planning to open one, they offer these. And of course, Karim Chubin is very happy to assist you. He's pioneered combination of vibrational therapy, sound therapy with these kind of technologies, and also synergistic combination of certain adaptogenic herbs even in these protocols. It's very exciting, and it's cool to hear that you have had a personal kind of hero's journey of trying to fix your own issues with mitochondrial dysfunction and succeeding with it, combining that with your long interest as a naturopath and bring that into the market in Switzerland. And Tour is a German company. You mentioned Germany has quite extensive uses of this, and there's a lot of countries out there that still need this for sure, that don't have no clue or idea that this can be used as well in the treatment of wide variety of conditions or just to enhance performance.
Thank you, Teemu. Just wanted to add one thing here. So it's very important, as you said. So Tur is a manufacturer of different medical devices, including IHHT. The reason I chose, and again, I'm not an affiliate of Tur's, I'm not employed by Tur, I'm an independent healthcare provider who, after having discovered the results on myself, not from an intellectual pursuit, but from an experiential, having experienced it and seen the transformation, decided to really jump in to dive into this. I chose Tur for several reasons. The ethics of the people behind the company, I discovered and visited several times the manufacturing plants. And also because many of us are sensitive or becoming increasingly sensitive to electromagnetic pollution and all the variety, this invisible pollution, which is unfortunately not invisible to our cells, but very detrimental to them. And what Tur has done is it's chosen to remain not only ethical, but not to become too technological, in the sense that the results are not cloud-based. All the data is in the device. There is no Bluetooth. There is no Wi-Fi. It's also very intuitive. And I used to try, when I tried, and I had another device initially at home, which I won't mention the name of right now. It was a good enough device, but the ebbs and flows were harder. The breathing was much harder. This is very important. It's much harder for a person, be that person compromised, whose health is compromised or not, to relax when you feel that change at the mask. With Tur, it's a very smooth breathe, and that's very, very important to mention. And again, I say this because some of us might know, for those of you who don't know, the field of CPAPs and people who have CPAP needs, such as myself, Philips, a very big company, had to recall its CPAPs a few years ago. And other companies such as ResMed, a very big Australian player, had to compensate for the shortage of devices on the market. One of the reasons why Philips had to recall the CPAPs was due to certain constituents inside the CPAP that were very toxic and that created a whole heap of side effects in many people, unfortunately. Why am I saying this? Because many of us don't know what foods we put into our bodies or supplements we swallow, let alone what are in the devices that we use and breathe. And what's very important is that, like with everything, it's all about who's at the beginning of the chain and the ethics of the people, the founders, the philosophy, and their honesty in choosing and assembling devices that are made with the most noble components. So for me, that was one of the reasons, being quite sort of difficult and strict with what I put into my body. And then when I introduced to my patients, I wanted a company that had very strong ethics. And I found that in Tur. So I'm very happy to be introducing that to the French part of Switzerland. Also in North America now, it's a big challenge with my business partner to really get more and more practitioners and people to understand that this could be used at home. It's very safe. And for those of you who out there who think, what happens if my saturation drops when I breathe? Well, the devices have been conceptualized in a way where they bring you back to sea levels and beyond. In other words, these are tools that are now becoming more and more affordable and more accessible, both price-wise and in terms of user-friendliness. And they could be used at home. And I'm ready to answer any question to help you at home, and if you're a clinician in your practice, to help your patients thrive.
So if anyone's interested in these devices, turweb.com, so Tur and line and web.com. There's cellular as well.
But there's a new device that we had actually, the Tur had at the stand when I came in Helsinki, called the Cellit, which is really exciting. So it's which is a medical device, mainly destined to practitioners, where you can keep an entire database in it. The Cellit is the first device globally that came out early 2023, January, if I'm not mistaken, meant to reach out B2C, reach out to people so people can understand that it's much more affordable than the cellular. The functionality is quasi the same. And the beauty of it is one button.
Super easy. And the website for Cellit is ihht-cellit.com. So that's where people can find more information. So ihht-cellit.com. Sounds like something one could buy at home. Actually, looking at the marketing, that's the consumer product. And so that's what they exhibited at the Biohackers Summit. So please check it out as well. And if you run a clinic, the company has more or clinical equipment available, a wide variety of them. And so if people want to know more about you, Karim Chubin, and want to work with you, I know many biohackers have come to you. Where can they learn more about your work?
Well, on my website, Karim Chubin, which is my name, .com, and on a new website called Longevity. That's my brand, my Swiss brand, which is essentially a brick and mortar concept. Longevity, which is a play on words between longevity and longevity, LOUNGEVITY.ch, which is now growing to Brussels and Lisbon, and hopefully early 2025 in the States as well. So the idea is to give people the possibility to breathe in different centers and eventually to then offer that in people's homes as well. We started doing this in the US. So if people can't come, we can come to you as well. I really want to get the message out and to reach out to at least 1 million lives.
So lounge, like a business lounge,
Yeah.
but
everything.
longevity, CH, that's where.
You like the name? Do you like the name, Teemu?
I think it's awesome. Yeah. That's something I would love to spend my time on instead of a business lounge that usually has crappy food anyways and drinks.
We'll get you. Have you actually breathed or not? We should get you a device for you to try. Have you tried IHHT or not yourself?
I haven't had it at home. I have tried it, yes, but I haven't done extensive training on it. So it would be very interesting to try out. Yeah, for sure.
Great. And I don't know if you come out to Geneva. It's not the most exciting of places. But you're welcome anytime to come and try and see what I curated here.
I actually do come quite often. I have some friends over there and I often spend some time. So maybe I come visit you next time. Awesome. So thank you so much for this interview. And I learned a lot, and I think our audience as well. And there was some rare up and coming information shared as well of new products and like combinations, as well as even some lesser known adaptogenic herbs to complement your typical of adaptogens that have become increasingly popular among biohackers and health optimizers. So thank you very much, Karim. This was awesome. And for the rest of you, have the best life ever. Thank you.